Welcome to the podcast. My name is Chris, and I'm the host of Is It Just Speculation? Stick around for more. Hello, everyone. So today I'm joined by Aliyah. Aliyah Ewing is a rising public speaker whose ultimate goal is to see freedom for all. She speaks about the global crisis facing our world, sex trafficking, specifically trafficking in Minnesota. In addition to being an advocate against sex trafficking, Aliyah is also involved in the fight against domestic violence, where she's aided victims via Anna Marie's Alliance, a nonprofit organization founded in 1979. Aliyah started her career in childcare, which has enabled her to better communicate the importance of internet safety to younger children in her current role as a prevention and education advocate. Hello, Aliyah.
Hi.
Hey, so thank you for jumping on and taking some time out of your day.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Mhm. So, before we start, I did want to just say I appreciate people like you doing what you do. I feel like there's not enough people that will actually spend their time and, really dedicate their life to doing something that helps other people. So I appreciate you and the work that you're trying to do and the work that you've been doing. Um, so if you want to just tell a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for saying that. It's so true. We need more people just dedicated to other people. But so I am a public speaker. Like you said, a rising public speaker in the bio. Um, and I just have a real passion for ending or seeing an end to human trafficking, and more specifically sex trafficking. And I first learned about it when I was 17, which was just so shocking to me because at no point in my life had I heard of it before. And just knowing like how devastating it was crazy that it wasn't more widely known or talked about. And now these past few years it has become more widely talked about, which is awesome. But then that also comes with a lot of sensationalism, which doesn't help as much. But
Mhm.
yeah, I just really want to see an end because everybody deserves freedom. Nobody deserves to be captive their whole life.
Yeah, how did you learn about it? You said when you were 17, but like, did something happen, or did you see a story that was just so, powerful where it pushed you in that direction?
Yeah, I was at a church event. I don't know if it was a service or just an event, but they were interviewing a former member of the church, and she had left because she had moved to another country because she had started working for an organization called Destiny Rescue. And so they're overseas in like Thailand, Cambodia, and the Philippines fighting sex trafficking. So she was talking about what she was doing at Destiny Rescue and what their mission was. Um, and so I've been following Destiny Rescue ever since. And if you follow them, they'll post updates about how many women they've been able to rescue and stuff like that every week. So it's really cool. But that's how I first learned about it.
Okay, and that's the moment, I guess, that you decided this is something you want to get into, because that's a pretty young age to really make up your mind about what you want to do going forward. Is that kind of when that seed was planted?
Yes, that's definitely when that seed was planted. And ever since I was a kid, any job I wanted, it was like a service job. For whatever reason, I just wanted to be helping people in some capacity because just knowing that I always have, more than somebody else has, um, why not spend time helping other people?
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned was you heard about it, through church. For
Mhm.
you personally, how important is faith in uh, people who have been through those kind of situations and people that come out of it? And for me personally, I've seen a lot of stories where survivors end up going into the church scene, if you will, and getting real involved with faith-based organizations. Is that something that personally you've seen?
Yeah, that is something I've seen. Just when you have faith and some type of faith, no matter how strong or how little it is, it's always something that helps survivors just a little bit more and gives them that hope for themselves, knowing that maybe there's someone out there that cares more about them too.
Yeah, and aside from your, sex trafficking and human trafficking, you're also uh, helping with domestic abuse. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, domestic abuse or domestic violence I've known about forever. I grew up with a little bit of domestic violence in my home, and it wasn't necessarily a field that I planned on working in, but it was like a stepping stone to getting into the world of anti-sex trafficking as well. And I love the fight against domestic violence. And I started out as a shelter advocate for about 6 months, so that I was just helping women and their children one on one in the shelter. So direct contact, getting them like daily needs, daily things that they needed. A
Hmm.
lot of that, a lot of times it's like birth certificates, security or social security cards and stuff like that, which takes some time and also costs money. So then finding that money piece for them as well, it's a lot of steps. So that's what I started out doing. And now I'm in prevention and education at the
Hmm.
same shelter where I get to like go into schools and have groups with kids and talk about healthy relationships.
Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Can you kind of talk about what is domestic violence? Is it just physical? Is it verbal? Is there other types? And who does it affect?
Yeah, there are so many types of domestic violence. They kind of fit under the umbrella of physical, emotional, and then sexual violence. But under that too can be isolation, as well as like money, like not giving you money, or you have to give all your money to that person, so they're controlling you financially. Um, and then faith as well, like controlling what faith you have or not letting you practice a certain faith we've seen before. That's a strong one as well. And then minimizing and denying and blaming so that you think all the abuse is your fault and minimizing what they're doing to you. Those are all different types of violence that can occur. And a lot of times, if you're seeing one, you're definitely going to be seeing two or three more. And it can affect absolutely anyone. It doesn't have, a certain race or it's not in a certain country. It's not, a certain social standard. It can affect anyone.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, and it's not the case everywhere, but there are a lot of different faiths and religions. One of the things that you mentioned is that's one of the ways that might be a way to control people. Is it possible that some religions, especially the ones that are geared more towards like an older style where the man is the one that's in charge and makes all the decisions, does that tend to maybe make it a little bit worse for some victims because it's kind of like an institutionalized form of control?
Definitely, if the abuse can start out that way, using faith against them, it can be really hard, if they believed in that faith for a while to um, like sort of undo that brainwashing,
Mhm.
that just because of what this faith is saying, or maybe, they're interpreting the faith wrong, maybe, and just telling you this is what it means and this is what it says. It can be really hard to break free of that. But then certainly when you do, it is so amazing, and they find so much strength in it still after that.
So, in your experience with victims and people who are going through, really uh, hard situations, are there any commonalities between the people that are more likely to be a victim? Like, is there like an underlying trait that kind of goes through all the different types of people that it can affect?
Yeah, there's definitely risk factors, different vulnerabilities. So if you don't know, like recent relocation or migration, if you don't know like the laws or the customs of the new place that you're in,
Mhm.
then you fall victim to things. Involvement in the child welfare system, being a runaway or being homeless, just that vulnerability of like wanting shelter or protection, and so then maybe you fall prey to something easier. And then of course mental health concerns, if you're not as easily able to identify like little or have like the instincts to notice that something might be wrong or somebody's giving off some bad vibes, then it's easier for you to become a victim. And then of course substance use, that's another way that people can be exploited or they can experience violence, because maybe you're getting your drugs from that person and you have to do what they say or they're forcing you to do what they say to get the drugs.
One of the things that I find interesting, and I've seen this in the past with people that I've known throughout my life, and I don't know if maybe you've seen a lot of this too in your work. Do you see people that are victims denying that they're victims, and why do you think they do that?
Yeah, it can be hard to identify as a victim, especially if you don't know. Like, I'm very big on sexual education because if you don't know what's happening to you, then you can't identify as a victim. So sexual education at appropriate levels, at appropriate age levels, is really important. So you know if something is happening to you, oh maybe this is wrong, you can go tell somebody. That's one reason why people necessarily don't identify, or maybe they think their situation wasn't as bad as other people's. And every situation is valid because no matter, if maybe you're experiencing less physical violence or more emotional violence than physical violence, it still is trauma. It still is hard to go through. And nobody should use that as a way to minimize what they went through. But that's another reason why people have a hard time identifying as victims. And then some people just don't want to, and they feel like it will make them weak if they identify as a victim.
Yeah, and one thing that I feel like maybe a factor, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, is there any difference between victims that don't have kids versus those with kids? Because in the past I've seen people stay with somebody who is not a great person to them, maybe abuses them verbally or emotionally, and they usually do that from what they say anyways, because they're kids. They don't want their kids to be without the other parent. Is that something that you've seen?
Yes, definitely. Um, just thinking that their parent or their kids need this, parental figure, um, because there's this belief out there that you need to have both parental figures, and whether or not that's a good belief to have, if one parent is detrimental to you or to your children, that's not a good role model for your kids, regardless, and you can find something better. Or just money. Maybe they don't make enough money on their own to support their kids and they don't want their kids to be taken away. So they're staying so that they have money to take care of their kids and they can stay with their kids, even though that means they have to stay with this person.
Yeah, and
Uh,
from your experience, like, do you find that a lot of times when there's, maybe kids are in a bad situation, maybe the family members are also kind of the same way as their parents, whether there's troubles at home or some kind of domestic issue. Do you find it hard for kids to actually find a home within their actual family to where they have to maybe end up in a foster home or adoption or something like that?
Yeah, that's a lot of times that's what you see. Um, because, there's also another stereotype out there where if you're maybe living in lower income homes or things like that, right, that then there's more violence or more crime associated in that area. But truly, it's if you're already living in lower income, there's less options for you to get out of it. And a lot of times that leads to things like different crimes, maybe stealing or violence because of frustration. And that is why you see more things like that in those situations. And so if you've been living in that for a while and your family has, then you all kind of have this mindset that's the same, right? And so maybe
Mhm.
the violence has been brought down for generations. And it's just that cycle of violence after generation. So it's really hard to break out of. And I really commend women that are able to break out of it, especially if it's, generation.
Yeah, and I kind of want to go back a little bit and ask you. You said that you personally had seen some domestic issues at home. If you're comfortable talking about that, if you can kind of give us a little bit of information about, what were those issues for you and how did you deal with those? And, on top of that, how do you plan on not carrying those towards, your family in the future?
Mm-hmm. Um, At home, and I really don't mind talking about it. I just have to be careful because not everybody in my family likes to talk about it.
Yes.
Um, so, one of my parents, both my parents really grew up with a little bit of domestic violence in their homes as well. And so one of my parents took that and decided to not let that happen anymore for their family going on, and, took parenting classes and everything like that, trying to be the best parent. And then the other one kind of not so much, and then alcoholism affected that, and that kind of led to more domestic violence, and it was more emotional and like verbal, so being called like stupid or an idiot and stuff like that. um,
Mhm.
and for me personally, my instinct is fight because being raised with three brothers, I always wanted to be tough. And so, I want to fight, but then at the same time, I know if I say anything, it could make it worse for my other parent.
Yeah.
So then I have to freeze, but then I just have this rage in me. Um, so it was really hard going through that. But my one parent that had chosen, to stop that cycle coming from them, they they taught me the definition of the different kinds of abuse. And knowing the definition, I knew what was happening as I was growing up. And in every domestic violence situation, I always say, no matter what, there's a way to get out. And in my situation and in my family, it really, even to this day, I can't think of a situation where we all could have gotten away from that one person and stayed together. Um, so it was kind of hard because then we all just had to, wait until all of us were 18 so that we
Yeah.
could get away from the abusive person. So it was just like growing up feeling trapped because I can't do anything. And so then I ended up by 16, I couldn't take it anymore. And I ended up knowing like, because one of my parents is from a different country. And so then they would go there for a little bit and come back. And so when I knew they were coming back and I just knew I couldn't live with them anymore,
Hmm.
and how controlling and just violent they were, mostly, verbally. I had already been asking friends around school, can I move in with you when my other parent gets back? And they said, okay. So I already had a house that I was going to go to that I was going to live at. So I just ended up moving out.
Okay. Yeah, that's I think something that happens to a lot of people where I think alcohol, people that drink is probably the most common type of domestic issue that people will see in their life. Because it's real visual. Like there's not anything that prevents people from going and buying it. Like once you're old enough, you can go get it in however many, quantities you want. And
Mhm.
people have this tendency to have parties every weekend or, on game day, really any reason to celebrate, they'll have a drink there. And then, some people are okay just drinking a little bit. And then some people don't really have that control. And then that's where you end up seeing, those domestic violence issues. Do you
Yeah,
think that there was maybe any difference when people had less access to go and get alcohol and things like that? Because maybe a few years back there weren't as many liquor stores, or maybe you had to go in our city. A few years back, you actually had to leave the city to go and buy some, and then recently they changed it to where you can buy it in the city. So like that kind of change, do you think it made it easier or harder for people to kind of fall into that cycle of drinking and then maybe domestic violence?
I think if you take one thing away, they're either going to try harder to get it or find something else to fill the vice. So, I see it even at the shelter where women at the shelter are addicted to cigarettes and they don't have money to get them. They'll just be going around looking for cigarette butts to find anything or
Hmm.
ask people multiple times to buy them cigarettes or to give them a cigarette, and where it's basically harassment. So I don't think it changed anything really, and it probably just frustrated people more, made them find different vices and or different more creative ways to get what they wanted.
Yeah, and you've talked about the place, Anna Marie's Alliance, a little bit. So, can you tell us a little bit about what like your normal day is there and kind of what their program does? And then, I mean, if you have any insights on how it's been helping people so far.
Yeah, definitely. I can speak about it from my point of view as an outside since I'm not clocked in right now. But
Yes.
we have actually, or Anna Marie's has actually a few different programs, and so one of them is the shelter program, where it's basically a 45-day stay, which can be shorter or maybe longer, depending on what the survivor needs. And also depending on our funding, because since we're a nonprofit, we get a little bit of government funding, and then we receive like most of our funding from grants and stuff. So then we have to stick to what our grants are saying we can use our money for. So like we can only take people from Minnesota, and it has to be certain. You have to meet certain criteria to be admitted to our shelter, which is really hard because we're the only shelter in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and so when you have to say, I'm sorry, you can't come to this shelter, then you have to find somewhere else that hopefully they can go. But there's not that many options out there. And so I remember your previous guest, Hannah Mosley, was saying like Arizona has Arizona 211. And I know Minnesota has a 211 where you can find open shelters too. And so then it's just going to that list. And then they have to meet the criteria of whatever that shelter is. And so it can be really hard. But then when they come into our shelter, that 45 days, we're trying to get them, like meet them where they're at and get them what they need. So Anna Marie's is based, or their program is based on trauma informed care, which is meeting the person where they're at. So whether they need like the birth certificate, social security card, all that stuff. Sometimes they will need those two things for themselves and then maybe for all their children. And then getting them clothes, helping them find a job. We have a daycare program so that if they are going out job hunting or different things like that, or looking for apartments, the daycare can take care of kids for a little bit and watch them. And the daycare can be really hard too because these kids in the daycare might have experienced trauma as well. So they might have hard behaviors, and then they're kind of all in one place. So that really has to be trauma informed too, and meeting the kids where they're at. And then we have a community program. And so we have community advocates that can help people get orders for protection and harassment restraining orders. And then we can't help people get DANCOs, and a DANCO is a domestic violence no contact order.
Mhm.
That is put out by a judge. So if a judge says or gives somebody a domestic violence no contact order and the victim or survivor doesn't want that, then they can come to Anna Marie's and take a safety planning class. And it's just a safety plan for, okay, so you don't want to have a domestic violence no contact order, so this person will have access to you. But what's your safety plan for if they become violent again? So I can't remember. I think it's a 2-hour class. And so then they can do that. They can help people with lease breaks because a lot of times then if you're fleeing domestic violence, you're just leaving your apartment, but
Yeah.
however long the lease is left, yeah, you don't want to have to pay for that. So thankfully we can help out with that. And then just get them connected to other services that can help as well is really important. And in my program, prevention and education, we, like I said before, go out to schools. We can actually teach all ages, so we can teach healthy relationships from kindergarten on up. And of course, then at the kindergarten, elementary age, it's like family and friends, relationships at schools with teachers and stuff like that. And then in the middle school, high school area, getting more into dating violence. And then in the adult area, just getting more into what exactly domestic violence is and how you can help. So those are kind of the different programs. And then on the shelter side as well, we have a pet safe house because a lot of times if you have an animal and they're going to be stuck with the abuser, a lot of times the woman won't leave. So having a pet safe house is really helpful for the women. And when you are calling somebody and they're saying, can I bring my animal with? And you tell them yes.
Mhm.
So I've had people just start crying, like thinking, I didn't think I'd bring my animal with. Like, no, not a lot of shelters have that because it costs a lot of money. So just being able to offer that is very helpful.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the like best things that I saw whenever I was kind of looking into, what the program offers. Because that's something I never would have thought would be something that would be provided or even, have thought to provide it. But
Yeah,
it is, a lot of people consider their pets fur babies. They're part of the family.
yeah,
Um, I know our dog has a social security number that we got from the veterinarian. So, it's part of the family.
yeah,
So yeah, yeah. So I can understand why people would, stay if they, consider that their family and they don't want to leave, especially if they're the ones that care for the pet and maybe they don't trust, leaving the pet to somebody who's, clearly not, in the right headspace.
yeah.
So I thought that was a really interesting thing. And, you mentioned Hannah Mosley and her program and yours that you work with, they both have a lot of similarities. And I really thought that was interesting to know that there's more places out there that offer similar things, but for different groups of people that need that kind
Mhm.
of help. So that was really interesting to kind of know, you know, how much help there is out there. And like you said, there's not a lot of those types of places,
Mhm.
but there are places that people can find. And those are just two examples. So there's, a lot of other ones out there. Is there anything that you see as being like a common final straw for victims where they decide, you know what, this isn't how I want to live my life. I need to get out and I need to make a change. Is there anything that you see that kind of ties all those people together in that one decision that they make?
Well, sometimes it's the first time that the abuser might get violent with their children, or maybe this time the abuser almost killed you, um, or maybe all of a sudden everybody around you knows what's happening, but it could be different for everyone. And on average, it takes women, 7 times to finally truly leave. So they might have left and come back 6 different times, and on that seventh
Mhm.
time, they might find the strength to leave for real. So it's always a different point.
Yeah, and in my previous episode with Hannah, I also talked a little bit about, and I just briefly mentioned it. I had stayed in a women's protective center with my family at one point when I was younger, and that's kind of how I got into looking into these type of programs and what they offer. But whenever I was little, that was kind of the reason for us to be there, is just to make sure that we were all safe. And one of the things that happened while I was there, and it was only a short amount of time that I was there, from what I remember. But one of the things that happened was there was a uh, man who was in the alley in a cable truck, and he basically had, said, "Hey, I need to have access to the yard so I can, do some work on the cable." Whatever the issue was that he was saying, and it ended up being where we actually let him in, and it turned out that he was one of the victim's husbands or boyfriends, and he found out where the home was at, and he basically used his job as a cover to get in. Um, Talking about Anna Marie's Alliance, is there something that is like a safety precaution to make sure something like that doesn't happen? And this was years ago, so I know that probably since then things have changed to where it's maybe a little bit more structured. But is there something in place to make sure that that safe place stays safe?
We definitely take many different precautions, and I'm sorry that that happened. That's so scary. And
Mhm.
that's a situation at Anna Marie's where people have tried to get in. So a few of the different things, uh, residents that are staying there are not allowed to let people inside, and so we tell them that right when they get there. There's uh, the shelter area actually where the applicants are sitting looks right out at the front door, so we can see who is right there, who's coming in. Um, and so if there's going to be like maintenance people there that are, they're usually men, then we're
Mhm.
told ahead of time, they say where they're from and what they're going to do before we let them in. We have, you know, Coburn's pharmacy comes and drops off medication sometimes, so we have to know who's coming in, as well as, we will look at IDs, and then we have cameras all around the shelter, so we can see the back of the shelter, we can see the parking lot, at any given time. And all of the cameras are right there at the main desk with the usually two advocates are on shift. So, and then we have a couple places have bulletproof windows as well. So those are just the first few things. And then all around the shelter and on the community side, we have panic buttons. And if you press a panic button, the SWAT team comes.
Yeah, that's very different from whenever I was, at that place. And this was like, I think, I want to say the late '90s, maybe early 2000s. Like I said, I was a little kid, but yeah, definitely different than my experience. So I'm glad to know that in your case, there's those extra layers of safety just to make sure that people feel safe going there. How do people find out about that place? And if they're maybe stuck in a situation and they don't have any plans of getting out, or maybe they do, like how do they actually end up at that place? Do you have community resources, or do they just randomly find it?
So that's part of my job when prevention education we go out and do presentations. That's to let people know what Anna Marie's is, and we always have business cards, brochures, just to get our name out there, as well as that 211 phone number. We should be on there, and they have a website, and it's called Day One. And so all the shelters are listed on Day One, what the shelter is for, so if we can't take somebody at our shelter, then we see all these other shelters and we can let them know. And a lot of times it's not the first time somebody's calling for shelter. So maybe just this time they were given our phone number. And then when different people have been at our shelter or have been given our shelter as a resource, then they know and they can tell their friends if maybe their friend is in a situation as well. So it's a lot of word of mouth.
Okay. We talked a little bit about people that seek out help, or maybe they have a friend that kind of bring them there to get help. But what can the average person who suspects someone that they know may be a victim, how can they help or maybe handle the situation if, let's say, you're at work and you see somebody come in with bruises frequently? It's, first, it's usually none of your business and tends to be ignored. But, for those people that do want to help, what can they do, like on an average, everyday situation?
Hey everyone, it's Chris, the host of Is It Just Speculation? What if I told you that you can make your very own podcast for free and you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership required? That's Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast, and that's what I use. It has all the tools that you need in one place so you can record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. So you can work on the go or you can work at home in the comfort of your PJs. That's what I do sometimes. Don't tell nobody though. Anchor also distributes your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more places all around the world within a matter of moments. That's the beauty of Anchor. It really lets you have a message and get it out there. You have your own voice, guys. It's everything that you need to make a podcast in one convenient place. Please download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. You're missing out if you don't.
It's really tough because when you see that happening, you don't want to go up and scare the person off by calling attention to what's happening right away. But I know even my friend who was also working at Anna Marie's, she was getting her hair done by somebody, and that person just knew where she worked. And one day eventually said, "Hey, you work at that women's shelter," and like let her know that she was going through abuse. Um, and just kind of talked with her a little bit about what she could do and what resources and just having that open communication. But definitely knowing what resources could be available to that person where you're at would be a good starting point before you even maybe start talking to them about anything. And then when you do start talking to them, maybe start out with just saying, like, hey, if you ever need something or if you need somebody to talk to, you can talk to me, or just letting that person know you're a safe person. Because a person's not really, or a victim survivor is not usually just going to come out and say it unless maybe they're really fed up. So just giving them that time to grow that trust with you, because they already don't have trust in their current domestic violence relationship. So growing
Yeah.
that trust is really important, and that will definitely help. But also, really just can't make that decision for that person. So trying not to force at all and trying not to put pressure on that person because they're probably already feeling that in themselves a lot.
Yeah, and being such a such a hard topic to talk about, because obviously if somebody's a victim, they don't want to share that they're a victim, and they, like I said, they may not know that they're a victim. Is there ever, in your experience, any cases where you see guys that are victims? Because we've talked about kids and women. Are guys ever victims of domestic issues?
Yes, they definitely are. It's sad because there's definitely not as many shelters for men who may be victims of domestic violence. For us, we can take their phone calls and we can talk to them as well as give them resources that are around in Minnesota to help them, but we can't have them at our shelter. Um, it's not as often of a call, but it's definitely out there. And I think for men, because we don't like the reason for not getting as many calls isn't because it's happening less. We actually see it happening more, which is the same for sex trafficking as well. It's happening to men or boys more. And there's just stigma so that, men are supposed to be strong and tough and they're not the victims. So it's less of a chance that they're going to come forward and admit that they are.
So you're saying that for sex trafficking, mostly it's men and children. Is that right?
It's, yeah, mostly children.
Okay. Yeah, that's something I didn't really know. And speaking of trafficking, it's obviously a worldwide issue, but uh, where you're at specifically, like who does it affect the most? Is it just children where you're at, or do you see a lot of mixed people that are affected by it?
It can be really hard to pinpoint in specific areas who it's affecting the most, just because it's hard to get data on sex trafficking in general. But definitely, I see it among the younger generation because of phones and not knowing about internet safety. But then, of
Mhm.
course, always it's not always, but of course, it happens to then older women as well, or like, people over 18. There's a lot of, bars and clubs or strip clubs around here, which are places where traffickers may hang out. So those are really popular areas. And so you see it with kind of everyone. I think,
So go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, I think when it's boys or men, it's usually in a situation where either it started out from when they were a kid, or they're getting income for their family and they don't see another way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, one of the things I always see is, they'll every so often do like an update on a prostitution sting or something like that, where they list out, who all was arrested, and a lot of times it's mostly guys. And that when I first saw that, that kind of shocked me because I didn't think prostitution was, you know, anything else but women.
Hmm.
So it's interesting to see that there's kind of like a balance between who it happens to,
Hmm.
and maybe it just doesn't get reported one way or the other just because it's already stigmatized as it is, let alone to say, oh, also it's happening to kids and also it's happening to guys. So it makes the problem worse if that's kind of the message that comes out of it. um, from what I've been able to understand, are a lot of the victims also runaways?
A lot of being a runaway makes you more vulnerable in general, right? Because we're talking about how they will need shelter or they'll need protection, or
Mhm.
maybe they just want somebody to love them. And so if you're a runaway, you're a lot more likely to be swayed by somebody coming up and offering that to you, even if maybe they don't have all the best intentions, because you want to feel safe.
Yeah, and with runaways, is the foster care system also kind of contributing to instances where people are getting trafficked?
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. It's hard to talk about because the foster care system is a good thing,
Mhm.
but even I was reading a book. It's a series of books mostly about domestic violence called Carrie. Um, and this girl, Carrie, she ended up at a foster home, and this was, I believe, somewhere in Europe. And one of the foster homes she went to, those people, like the foster parents, were selling the children that were in their care. So you can see it that way, as well as, okay, you're in this foster family, you don't feel like this is your home, you don't feel like you fit in with this family. So then you're still looking for love, you're still looking for protection from somebody else.
Yeah, and you had mentioned like things like strip clubs. In addition to that, other sex work, as it's called. Is that hurting the fight against trafficking, or does it help because they're actually choosing to go into that kind of work and kind of owning their own identities? What are your thoughts on that?
That's it's a really hard hard topic to talk about, just because there are so many people who get so mad if you say, yeah, it's not helping the fight against sex trafficking at all, but it truly isn't, because even the founder of Exodus Cry, he had met this survivor, and she said when she first started being trafficked, the quote was, "I felt empowered. People wanted to buy me. I had
Mhm.
value." And the explanation for that was that she had been groomed by her culture long before she had been groomed by her trafficker. So, she thought it was good or good if she was sexy, looked good, if boys wanted her, and oh, well, now they're willing to pay for me, and not realizing that what they really wanted is just to use somebody, and it's another power and control.
Yeah, that's a easy way to kind of fall into being a victim. Just maybe thinking of it a different way. and seeing the positive part of it. Because, everybody wants that attention, especially now with social media, like I had, previously talked about before, just that constant need to be out there. And sometimes that goes with things like TikTok and Instagram, where people are posting pictures that, when I was a kid, I would never post a picture like that.
Yeah,
So is social media kind of the same thing, where it's a good thing because you have ways to communicate messages, get outreach out there, contact people. But on the flip side of that, you also have these really, dark places where maybe it doesn't help. Is that kind of the same situation?
100% the same situation. Um, there are so many ways for traffickers to contact victims through so many apps because now so many apps do have chat features, or their whole purpose for the app is chatting. When I was looking up the most popular apps to talk to kids about, a lot of them were apps I hadn't even heard of, and their main function was just to chat. And then all you have to do is, say sweet words to somebody or
Mhm.
identify their vulnerability, and then let them think that you can fill that need. So it's super easy to get through people through so to people through social media. And then just that, like, not even just social media, but like what we're seeing on all these streaming services, all these new ones popping up when they're making their own TV shows. A lot of TV shows now, it's just sex scenes right from the get-go, and kids have access to that way easier than we did growing up. I remember, um, if somebody asked me my favorite TV show, it was really easy because there weren't as many options. But now you ask kids
Yeah.
that, and they can't pick because there's so many streaming services, there's so many options, and a lot of them are showing that sexualized nature.
Yeah, that's a good point. Back whenever I was growing up, we had cable and stuff, but I mean, for the most part, you just had like the main channels where, the football games or basketball or the news would come on, and it'd be like, NBC, CBS, ABC, those kind of things, especially if you weren't fortunate enough to have cable or satellite. So
Yeah,
now that you have everything, somebody tells you to check out a show, you're like, well, is that on TV? Is that on YouTube? Is it a Hulu or Netflix? Do I have to get
yeah,
Amazon Prime? Like, where is it at?
yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely more easy to kind of fall into different things. And like I said, there's good and bad. A lot of those places have documentaries that cover issues that are important, but
Yeah.
also they'll suggest watching a movie that's rated R and for good reason
Mhm.
afterward. So it's like, are you trying to help or are you hurting the cause just by having those other options? Um,
Always like playing, right? It's when you turn on Netflix or any of those, the show that's playing is usually something that's sexualized or something, that they're advertising, like, watch this.
yeah, yeah, and it gets people to check something out that maybe they wouldn't before. And that's one of those big things with social media in general, just having those algorithms that point you to stuff that maybe you saw one or two videos of, and now it's like, hey, you want more of that? Here you go.
Hmm.
Where you may have not been searching out for that kind of thing. Now you always have to watch out for pop-up ads,
Yeah.
um, and that's like a whole other thing by itself because uh, there's ads that come up that you wouldn't have no idea how to stop. Even if you have an ad blocker, you just click a button and it pops up anyways. Is there, in your opinion, is there like a need to censor more, or do you think it's just kind of up to the individual and the family to monitor what's going on?
I think when it comes down to it, it's a lot up to the family to censor what their kids are seeing. It's just a lot harder now, especially if they're given electronics younger. But I do think we should be censoring more just, for certain age groups. And, if you're not clicking on porn to watch porn, then I don't want to click on a TV show and all I'm seeing is sex. And so, I wish TV shows could just be TV shows again and be telling a story. Um, so that wasn't just the only option out there for kids to watch. And then, like, if you're not watching it, then, oh, you're not mature or you're not cool. Or, a lot of people like to think like you're just a prude, um, and uptight or something, or like that stigma, you're a Christian, so of course you don't like it. Um, but no, it's just really harmful to kids.
Speaking of kids, how do you actually message to kids? And what I mean by that, for example, you mentioned porn. if you were talking to a group of kids, and we'll say they're a little bit older, not super young, but you mentioned maybe something like, if you ever come across porn, you should turn it off, and this is why. Is there a danger in actually talking about it to where those kids didn't know about it before, but now they want to go and see what she's talking about?
I think there's always that danger, um, and you just never know, but you still should talk about it because nowadays kids probably know about it just because of all the access to electronics already and what people are talking about. Because you don't have to be, you know, 15 to have access to older conversations like on Facebook, maybe that people are having in comments, and it could be about porn or different things like that. So and you don't have to have a phone as the kid. You don't have to have a phone yourself to have access to it because maybe your friend does and you're hanging out with your friend. So a lot of kids most likely already know about it, but even if they don't, I think it's still really important to talk about because when you think about porn, you don't hear the negative effects that it could have.
Yeah, and kids in general don't really understand, um, kind of like what sex even is, let alone altered version of it. So yeah, I think messaging with kids is probably the hardest part of what you would do from an outside perspective looking in. Do you find it the hardest part of what you do talking to kids, or is it the adults that are kind of more stuck in their ways, to where maybe they're the harder ones to reach?
I think it is, people who are stuck in their ways, adults that are stuck in their ways, and then just this like wave or like movement of people who are just mad at you if you say anything like, you know, sex work can be detrimental to the entire fight against human trafficking. Or no, we don't need to just watch sex scenes. Like I skip through sex scenes, and when I tell people that, they'll roll their eyes at me. Um, it's it's kind of crazy, and I think that's what's really hard, and it's really hard to get through to those people because um, it's really just a lot. It's very opinion based, I guess, but there's a lot of facts out there that can show you, why and how it can be detrimental.
Yeah, one of the things that came to mind was Game of Thrones. I had never watched it like the whole
Me,
time it was out until like the last season.
oh,
Have you seen that show?
I haven't seen it.
Okay, so yeah, I didn't watch it till like the very last season, and then I just went back and binged everything.
Mhm.
And to my surprise, there was like a lot of stuff in there that you would not expect to be in a show. Even though it was on HBO, I went into it just blind, thinking it's just like Lord of the Rings or something.
Yeah.
Um, but to my surprise, I would tell people about the show, like, "Hey, go check it out. It's been really good so far." And
Mhm.
then I watch another episode, and I'm like, "Oh my God, what did I just point people to? Like, there's just crazy things happening." Um, so yeah, if you ever were to watch it, you would be in for a surprise. So
Oh
that
yeah,
caught me off guard.
way. Yeah, because I
Mm-hmm.
heard, about different things that happen in the show, and I already work with it. I don't want to see a scene where it's reenacted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was one of the most popular shows for a long time. So for a show like that to be as popular as it was, and I think they're even making like a spin-off show of it. But for something like that to be out there and people to be introduced to violent scenes or sexual scenes that they wouldn't have been before, I feel like that's even a hard thing to fight, because you're not fighting against traffickers or domestic abuse people who actually abuse people. You're fighting against a TV show and
Mhm.
HBO network, and millions and millions of dollars that go into putting that out there. Like, how do you actually fight those kind of places where the messaging isn't really the best?
I mean, I just remind people that like a lot of those shows and stuff are based on different times, right? Like that show, it kind of is like that medieval culture going on,
Hmm.
where like that stuff did used to happen, and it was a lot more common. How does that make it right in any way? And I know maybe the show entertains you, but you have to keep in mind that yeah, that doesn't make it right. That they were doing it just because it was way back then, and that a lot of things that happened way back then weren't right. Like how women, it wasn't illegal to rape your wife until like the 1970s or something. Like a lot of things that happened back then weren't right. And that TV show is just highlighting that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's just one example. I'm sure there's a lot of other ones that are out there that could kind of fit the same description. I know whenever I get recommended shows, I'm always like, well, can I watch it around my kids? Because that's like the ultimate test. Like if I can, then okay, I'll check it out. If I can't, I'll probably put it on the back burner and maybe watch it way down the road. So
Yeah.
that's kind of like my personal test. Can my kids watch it? Um, we talked a little bit about kind of identifying victims for domestic violence. How would the everyday person know if somebody is being trafficked from your experience? And what are the signs?
That's really hard, because I've heard, as I was looking more into sex trafficking, that people have all these ideas in their head, like this is what a trafficking victim looks like, and then they're reporting this stuff, and people are getting searched because maybe this family adopted a kid of a different skin color, and they're walking around an airport because they're traveling, right? And now all of a sudden, somebody thinks they're being trafficked. So it's really hard to say, this is how you identify a victim. But I believe it was Rebecca Bender who she was a trafficking victim, through an escort service in Las Vegas, and she said her emotions were just up and down like a roller coaster when she first started being trafficked. And then, another sign is like maybe this person has friends that they're not bringing around any of their other friends, any of their family that they normally would. They're acting different around this group of friends. Another way is like secrecy about communication, um, because maybe now all of a sudden they can't text people or take a phone call in the same room as you, or maybe as soon
Yeah.
as they get a phone call, they're leaving because that's the trafficker calling saying, "Okay, now you have to come. It's time, to be trafficked."
Yeah, I think those are some things that people could look for on like an everyday basis just to see if they have any, warning signs. And we talked about kind of approaching it maybe in a softer way than rather just confronting them and being like, hey, are you a victim? Like, do you need help? So I guess would the thing be kind of the same where people maybe talk to them in a more friendly way, kind of build up trust, and then maybe ask them like, "Hey, are you okay? Is there anything you need?" Like, how do you actually help somebody that maybe doesn't want the help or doesn't need it?
Yes, a trafficking victim is probably even more so than a domestic violence victim, not going to come out and say anything about what's happening to them. A lot of the times, their trafficker has threatened them, like, if you talk to anybody else, I will know, and then there's going to be some kind of punishment. So sometimes, if you go up to them, they might even just walk away right away. Um, so it's really hard to identify, and even then, just to talk to somebody to see, what could be happening with them. And sometimes maybe you just got to watch for a little bit, and then maybe that is when you just have to call and give a tip like, hey, I think this person might be being trafficked. Like if you can't get close enough to that person because of how brainwashed they are, but you see something might be happening, that might be what you need to do. But if maybe you're closer to that person's maybe a family member or a friend, you might be able to just start talking to them, let them know that you're always there. Because if you're being sex trafficked, you're most likely isolated. And even if you're not physically isolated, like away from your family or friends, you're probably very emotionally isolated. So breaking through that wall and just having that little bit of trust there. And so it's definitely not going to be something like in a week they're going to trust you. That that relationship would take a long time to build enough trust.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Building that trust over time for sure might help, especially if you, like my example earlier, if you were a coworker, you've obviously worked with them for a certain amount of time, and maybe you have a way to build trust over time where, if it was just a random stranger, you can't really build trust in a, casual conversation.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the best way to approach it. I do want to talk about your public speaking a little bit. First of all, did you pick like the worst time in the world to try to do public speaking with pandemic?
It kind of all started because somebody like my goal is to be, a public speaker on the topic of sex trafficking.
Mhm.
And so I just whenever I talk to people and they ask me like my job, I'll tell them what I do, but I'll tell them this is my goal. And so eventually somebody who I told that to asked me to speak, and I was like, well, if they're asking me to speak, I might as well take this as my opportunity to
Mhm.
finally start. And so, yeah, it did happen at maybe the worst time, but at least it wasn't March 2020 or something.
Yeah, that's a good point. So have you done any public speaking in the past, maybe in school or college, that kind of like prepared you to be able to get up in front of people and just have a speech? Personally, I've only done a few speeches in my life, and two of them were at weddings. Some of the other ones were at college. So I would not, I don't think I'd be able to stand up in front of a big group of people and just talk, especially because I'm an introvert.
I'm definitely an introvert too, and people always say that to me, but I've never been afraid to get up in front of people. I really am not sure what it is. Mostly because I'm a singer, I think. So but singing though, you have the words that you're already gonna, be singing.
Yeah.
So there's nothing to worry about. So public speaking, no matter how much you practice, is a little bit harder, and it's not something I ever thought that I really want to do. But like I took a public speaking class in college as well, and I wouldn't say I was the greatest. I was supposed to give like a 10-minute speech. I gave like a 3.5 speech.
Yeah.
Um, and I was just always really nervous. But then, like, when I learned about sex trafficking and how much I just wanted to talk about it and spread awareness, and when I was doing that, I didn't have like the anxiety I would normally have, and I didn't have stage fright. And it was like because I knew what I was talking about, and because I cared so much. And I think like those are two things. Like, if you have those things, then you can you can public speak about anything. Like if it means enough to you.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the same for me. Like, I it's a weird thing to look at because I am so introverted and I don't really do like small talk or casual conversations. I don't think I've ever really been that way, but on the flip side of that, I can talk to a stranger for like an hour and have it sent out across the world, and I'm okay. So yeah, it's very interesting. And one thing I would mention is when I first started having guests on, people thought that I already knew my guests, um, but in reality, I had only talked to them to schedule the podcast and maybe like a minute before the podcast started, just to make sure we could hear each other. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, it's definitely interesting how even though we're both introverts, we can go out and do those things that are the opposite. Is that something that you look forward to, just doing more of it?
I definitely look forward to it. And my philosophy is, because of my anxiety, I love to say no to things if I don't know what to expect.
Mhm.
But when it comes to sex trafficking and what I want to do with my career and just helping the fight, um, my philosophy is I'll just say yes to everything and I'll worry about it later. So like when I said yes to speaking to you, so
Mhm.
excited right away, right off the bat. So much anxiety leading right up to it though. But like I knew, once you start talking about it, it's really important and the anxiety just kind of goes away.
Yeah, I completely relate to that. I feel the same way every time I'm about to talk to somebody. I would say probably my hardest one I did was with Anya. She was the marine biologist, and the reason it was the hardest thing was because we're from different countries. So there's those cultural differences, and on top of that, I didn't really know too much about like her specialty. And with talking to Asa about COVID and vaccines, I kind of like was aware of that because it's been in the news for like 2 years. So I had a little bit better idea of that. So I understand being anxious and maybe not knowing what you're getting into, because that's something that I have to face myself. Um, One thing that I did want to ask you about, and I also didn't want to ask you about, but I felt like it's one of those questions that is kind of in the gray area that I like to cover.
Okay.
Have you found it hard to try to do what you're doing, both in your career and also your public speaking, because you're younger? And from my example, whenever you first go into the real world and start looking for a job, everybody says you have to have experience before you can get a job. Like, how do you really do that if nobody will hire you to give you the chance? Do you kind of have that same struggle with being a little bit younger and being into the things you are?
Absolutely. As soon as you were saying that, I was like, yes, it's a real struggle. But what I did and what I've always kind of done is I just started with one step, like at the beginning. So like I started working with children first to see do I like this? And no, I don't like working with children who don't have real problems. So move on, right? Working with children with special needs a little bit, and
Mhm.
then realizing, okay, now that I've done this and I have experience like giving kids medication, um, dealing with special behaviors and stuff like that, calming down situations, those are all things that like, even though I didn't have experience in a domestic violence shelter previously, those were all things that I would need to do at a shelter with residents. And I wasn't
Mhm.
scared to do that. Um, and for some reason, like then when you get your foot in the door, it was just like the most comfortable job to me. And people were saying that to me who worked there. And it really surprised me, but I was like, yeah, it feels good. So then when you fit in, and I always just think, do your job to the best of your ability and also be as professional and respectful as you can, because if you aren't doing as best you can, if you're not showing up when you're supposed to, if you're not meeting these things, you're still not going to move up, and then you're young on top of it, right? So
Yeah, and yeah, that could be a real problem. I I would say like in my own personal experience, whenever I think I might have been 19 or 20, like I was pretty young. I got the opportunity to do like a recruiting and training job, and what that meant was that I was in charge of a lot of groups of people of new hires and also some of the original employees that were still there. And there was a guy who had already been retired twice. He worked at a college in my city, and he retired there. And then he went into the military, retired there, and then he jumped into the job that I was working at. And he had already been there, I believe, for 30 years. So like his whole life basically was just working at different jobs long enough to retire.
yeah,
Um, and me being like a 19, 20-year old trying to tell, I think he might have been in his late 70s, trying to tell him like what to do was really weird. Do you find like a disconnect trying to talk to people that are a little bit older than you, but you still have this information that you know can help them?
yeah, I think more so with like people that I work with, not necessarily like at Anna Marie's or anything,
Mhm.
but because there are a lot of people who have been in the field for a while, have a degree, or are working on their masters. Because like working on a degree or having a degree was one of the stipulations for my job, and I'm not doing either of those things. So but then on the other hand, when I'm giving presentations for Anne Marie's, a lot of people, even though I am young, kind of look at it as she's motivated at a younger age to do something, you know, for the fight against domestic violence or for the fight against sex trafficking. And then they see it as a really good thing. So it definitely depends on the type of person.
Yeah, and these things take time. Like I mentioned before, the Anna Marie's Alliance was founded in 1979, I believe, and
Yeah,
it's still going. Like it's not like it's just going to fix itself overnight. So,
no,
from my perspective, seeing younger people get into that kind of work and really being those pushers of change, I feel like that's why you're so great at what you do, just because you are committing your life and your time to do things that maybe people a little bit younger aren't really looking at doing. Um, just a few more questions, if that's okay.
yeah.
So, someone may be listening to this and realizing that they may be in a bad situation, whether it's abuse, physical, verbal, emotional, or even trafficking. As bad as that is, there might be somebody that hears this that's realizing, what, I'm in that situation, but I didn't really realize that. Talk to that person. What do you say to someone who's in a bad spot like that?
Well, I would first of all say, like, you don't need to be ashamed of your situation. You don't need to feel like everything is your fault. And no matter where you are, there is help somewhere. The internet is a great place, and a lot of websites that are for victims survivors of domestic violence and sex trafficking have a button right on the website for a safe exit from the website, so that maybe if you're afraid of the person who is harming you coming up to you while you're on the website, there's a safe button and you just click it and it exits the website right away. As well as there's a national hotline for both domestic violence and sex trafficking. And just starting somewhere, just because you're looking into something doesn't mean you need to make a big decision right away.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like we talked about earlier, planting that seed is all you really need. Like if you just have the thought about it, you don't have to do anything with it today, tomorrow, or that same year even. You just sit on that and you think about, what do I really want in my life? Especially if people are on the younger side. I know that, a lot of older people maybe have been in a situation too, but on the younger side, you have your whole life to live. If you're older, it's harder to make that change. And I feel like it's maybe harder to restart your life because you might not have the best life, but if you have your life kind of established and you're used to it, it's hard to make that change. Is there any advice you would give people, whether they're on the young end or the older end, um, for the reason to make that change?
Yeah. On the other side of that, it's really hard to see what could possibly be on the other side of what you're going through or what your life would be like if this abuse wasn't happening, or because abuse just takes over pretty much your whole entire life, and then you're going through trauma like the whole time. You could be developing different mental illnesses from it and physical illnesses. um, so hard to see what's on the other side, but when you get to the other side, it is so worth it. And the thing is, some people think there isn't something else out there for them. So just knowing that there is something out there, and whether that's through faith, through family, through friends, through whoever it is, um, there is something out there for you. And I want everybody to know that, besides what you're going through. And you might not have any idea what that looks like, and it might not be the best thing for a little while, but eventually you're back in control of your own life, making your own decisions, and getting to do good things with your life again.
So, from our conversation today, we covered a lot of topics that are really, uh, hard things to talk about. I think, some of the questions might have been a little bit uh, harder to answer because it is such a gray area. What would you like people to take away from our conversation that we had today, or even your work?
I think one thing to take away is that an abuser or a trafficker can be anybody, as much as a victim survivor can be anybody. And I don't want people to think, because we talk about how good it is to work in the fight against it.
Mhm.
And I always want people to know you're not a bad person just because you're not dedicating your life to these issues. Doing the smallest things, like maybe letting somebody um, in your social circle know of a resource because you think they might be going through something, or just keeping educated on domestic violence and sex trafficking in your area, seeing little things you can do to help. And yeah, staying educated is definitely one of the biggest things. You don't have to have your life dedicated to either of those things to make a difference.
Well, again, I definitely just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day and really opening up to all the questions that I had. So, like I said, I know a lot of them are gray area questions where, there's not like a simple answer. And that's part of what the process is. Like you have to work on it and work on it. And, I think the outreach that you're doing, the public speaking that you're going to be getting into, um, I really feel like that's going to make a change for a lot of people. And you've already seen it in your work as people kind of progress through the process. So just thank you again. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, thank you so much for having me on, and I'm excited to keep listening to your podcast.
I appreciate it. How can people get a hold of you or follow you on social media?
I have an Instagram and a Facebook so far. Eventually, I have a website, but you can find me at my name, Aliyah Ewing, public speaker on Facebook, and then my Instagram is A Ewing, public speaker. Those are the two places.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the episode. It's a tough subject. And, this is kind of a lead into my next guest, which I've mentioned previously in my last podcast. So if you look for those hints, or if you pay real close attention, you can see kind of what the next move is. We're covering some really sensitive topics, some really, I like to say, gray area topics where maybe things don't really get talked about too often. So this was kind of a lead up into that. Hopefully you're following the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Anchor, which is also my new sponsor. If you haven't tried Anchor, highly encourage you to try it out. Make your own podcast, make your own episode, talk about whatever you like, whatever you want, whether that's fitness, your favorite books, your favorite shows. Heck, you can just get on there and vent. Never too late to start a podcast. I guess I'm kind of proof of that. Not to say that I'm old, but whenever I was a kid, we didn't have internet, so maybe I am. But yeah, definitely go and follow the podcast. If you want to look at my Instagram or my Facebook, feel free to do that. Most of you have me on Facebook. If you don't, you can go to my Instagram at Chris Garcia, the real one. And in the bio, I have all my links for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and my podcast. So again, guys, I couldn't be here without you. Whenever you listen to the podcast, that's the best thing. Second best thing, sharing the podcast. If you share it, if just one other person goes and listens to it, you're helping me. And I appreciate that more than I think you really know. Like I said, this is just kind of a hobby for me. I had a lot of random thoughts throughout the day. I thought, you know what? Why don't I put those thoughts out there? And, once I had my first guest on, I was immediately hooked to the idea of just talking to people. And a lot of you may know I am a introvert. I've mentioned it previously, but for sure I'm not much into conversation. But you put me on with somebody who specializes in something that I really want to learn about, or I want to find out more about. It's really fun to just talk, and you guys have made my hobby into something more than a hobby. So I again, so thankful. So like I said, make sure you follow the podcast. Make sure you follow on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you want to follow me. And just keep an eye out for new episodes. Like I said, when you see those, if you have any suggestions, any feedback, anything on your mind, just let me know. And I sincerely take those things to heart. I've already made some changes to the podcast that may not have been done without the feedback that you guys give me. So again, thank you very much, and stay tuned.